Hello and welcome to the first lesson in the Working in Oils class. Today we're going to be having a look at materials and tools, which I covered briefly in the introduction. We'll be going into a bit more depth with that in terms of how the paint's made, different tools we're using, and how to approach using them. I'm also going to outline a basic process that we're all going to go through to start to build a picture. And I'll also be looking at how we start that process. So we'll be putting our first layer of paint on the surface and finding out a few things about how it works, and hopefully really feeling it under the brush, as it were, so that we can start to get familiar with the paint and how it behaves. So let's get started. First things first, materials. Now, we could ask ourselves, what is oil paint? Well, oil paint is exactly what it sounds like. It's pigment, which I have some here, and it's oil. I have some of that in this jar here. In this instance, it's linseed oil. A lot of brands will tell you what the medium is, and that's what we mean by medium, is the oil that it's mixed with. Something like this is mixed with safflower oil, which is a slightly different oil. I have some here. And different oils will have different consistencies, but linseed oil is the go-to oil. It's used for all manner of paints. It can yellow ever so slightly. Most paints that doesn't make a difference, but it's the reason something like white will often be mixed with safflower oil. Also some clear blues that we don't want going green. Yeah, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll give you a little example. Now, this is titanium dioxide, I believe. Might just be titanium oxide. It's also used as a food additive, so I wouldn't play around with any pigment that you couldn't eat, basically. And if I just put a bit of oil onto the palette as well, just like that. Now I'm going to mix this with a knife, and as I put the pigment into it, it starts to turn into a kind of a paste. At first a gooey paste, so that means I can get some more pigment in there. So let's chuck the rest of that in. And as I add pigment, the paint will stiffen. Now this isn't the process by which paints are actually made. They'll usually be done in big machines. Traditionally, it would have been mulled with a glass block called a muller, and that will grind it up really fine. So this would be slightly lumpy. But yeah, there you have it. There's some oil paint. Now, oil as a medium has particular qualities. Up until, I suppose, around the time of Giotto, tempera, egg tempera, was the main painting method, and they'd use the egg yolk, which has long chains of proteins, which would harden as the medium, and then they would add pigment to it. But you could only make very short strokes, not long flowing strokes. Also, it was hard to create much transparency. It tends to be short, opaque strokes of paint, and there's some really good painters these days. Anthony Williams, one of my favourites, who you still use tempera and do some wonderful stuff with it. But it's limited as a medium, like any medium will be. What they found is when they started using oil, they could introduce more transparency, and glazing became a real thing. But also, you can really load it up with pigment, so you can make this really quite thick. Now this is quite coarse pigment. If you look at some of Rembrandt's paintings, there's sand in there, there's really coarse pigment that gives it this lumpiness, and you can see it's going a bit lumpy now. So we've got this sort of thick paint here that's sort of got this texture to it. This paint over here is still quite smooth and runny. So the oil, the way the oil differs from tempera is that with tempera it would, any water in it would evaporate and it would leave behind the egg yolk, which would harden and the chains of proteins, like you'd also get with milk. This is a good example. If you've ever tried to get Weetabix off a bowl that's been there for 2 days, you'll know how well it sticks. So it's effectively used like a glue. Now, with oil paint, the oil behaves differently. The oil absorbs oxygen gradually. So over a period of time, it will dry from the outside in. And what that means is that it will stay wet for longer, it will stay workable for longer, or open, as we call the paints on the palette. So when they haven't formed a skin, the paints are open, and paints that stay open for longer are favoured by some artists. When it does form the skin, the drying slows right down. It's harder for the air to get in. There's paintings in museums that are still wet on the inside. Especially if you look at a de Kooning, I often think it would be quite good to be able to get behind it and scrape out all that paint and send it back to students. It looks like a waste. The gradual absorption of oxygen means the paint actually thickens up as it dries, and that the oil itself is part of the paint and remains there. It doesn't evaporate like the water in watercolour or acrylic paint. So it becomes part of the paint, and the more oil there is, the more it thickens and allows the light to bounce around the different layers of paint. So there's more luminosity, there's more play of light within the paint itself. And that's one of the things oil paint really has going for it. That you can do that as well as making very flat impasto colour where it's all surface. So that's the thing to think about when you're mixing paints. Remember how they're made, and if you want to make them more transparent, you can add oil. But that would be at a later stage. If you want to thin them with thinners, then that behaves like the water in watercolour would. It will evaporate and leave that paint behind. So if you can thin a paint with thinners, then that thinner will evaporate, and what it will leave behind is the consistency of paint that there was before. So if you've got thick, sticky paint, you put thinners in it, you paint it on, the thinners evaporate, and it leaves behind this rather thick and sticky paint, which a lot of the time, if you're working in one sitting, you can paint over the top of. So we can control the behaviour of paint at different layers, and that's something we're going to look into more and more as we go along. Now, you notice here I'm using this palette knife. Notice how I'm using it. There's a bit getting on the top there, but generally I'm only using the underneath of the knife. This is some mixing advice. I'm scraping up the paint and I'm spreading it out, and it's all happening on the underneath of the knife. Any paint that gets on top isn't interacting with the mixing process, so that isn't really helping us. Now if I say I wanted to add a bit of blue to that, let's mix up some blue, shall we? Let's take that in two halves so we can do it right and wrong. So let's do it right first. Okay, I'm going to pick up some of my white that I've just mixed. I'm going to spread it out, I'm going to scrape it up, and this is the scrape and slide. I'm going to slide it outwards. This might feel a bit slow to begin with, and that's pretty much mixed already. Squeezing it all off, there's a bit on the bottom of the knife there. Scooping it all up, spreading it out, and we have some nicely mixed paint. Now what I often see is people doing this, which does mix the paint, but it's leaving white around the edges, and so dabbing doesn't do much, stirring doesn't do much. Also, if lots of the paint is on the top, it's going to work its way up the top of the knife, and then if you've got, I've got a dark colour like blue here, so and I put that on the top of the knife and I try and spread it out, and I've still got this dark blue up at the top. So yeah, scrape, slide, it's all mixed up in a few goes. So speed on the palette, is a useful thing. So that's the paint itself and mixing. This leads me on to this idea of the palette itself. The palette itself is where everything happens. That's where all our colour decisions are made. And so it's absolutely vital that palette has to work for you. And when we see someone painting, or when we imagine someone painting, we think of them with a brush in their hand and a canvas, and they're doing this, and then a painting appears. But without the palette doing its job and helping, none of that's going to work. You know, if you've got the wrong colour on the brush, that's not the painting you want. If you haven't got the paint mixed in a way that's suitable or, you know, for the purpose you're working with, then that's not going to work out for you either. So it all happens here. Now, in terms of laying out the palette, I'll just move that. In terms of laying out the palette, I have this palette laid out in a way that's hopefully quite clear to you. I've got my white here, and then I've kind of got two things happening. I've got the colour wheel, if you like, so I'm going from yellow into the more orangey colours. That's Rwanda, that's dark yellow, into the reds, so that's an orangey red, and then into a cooler red, and then into the violet, and then into the blue. Now I've put green at the end, and because, you know, that sort of takes us back round to the yellows. So we've kind of got this colour wheel here. But there's another thing going on. You'll notice that it goes from light to dark. Put a little intruder here in the tonal range, but these colours are lighter and they darken up as they go. And partly that's to do with the pigments and how they behave. But it's also to do with the quality of yellow. Yellow only exists as a luminous colour. So this dark yellow, you go, well, that's not yellow. But in fact, that's where it would sit on the colour wheel. It's not an intense colour, but yeah, it's definitely a yellow. So that, yeah, that's an order I like. So I would try and apply that kind of thing. I've also got this axis of warm and cool colours. So these are warm colours. You know, these are the colours I use if I was painting something in sunlight. And these are the colours I would use for shadows and what would you call it? Yeah, cooler colours. So that this is an order I remember, and I'm going to keep that order the same whenever I work. So if I look at another palette here, well, hey presto, what have we got? White, yellow, there's a raw umber in the middle, there's a warm red, there's the cool red, there's some ultramarine, there's some green. So that system is something I use again and again. Now you don't have to do exactly the same thing. You might have some particular preferences. You want them to be choices rather than a bad habit that you persist with, but it's good to know where to go for what you need. If you just put those colours randomly around the palette, you're going to get lost. The other thing to notice is they're at the edge. These raw colours are at the edge. Now the colours I'm painting with will all be from within the inside of the palette, which means I have to mix them. Even if they're almost identical to these ones here, I still want to be mixing, I still want to be making a choice. I won't be taking colours out of straight out of the blob of paint at the edge and putting it straight onto the canvas. If it looks like I'm doing that, I'm probably just picking up a little bit with the brush, mixing it just here because it's just off that strong colour, and then applying it. There's always a mix that happens before it goes onto the canvas. Boy races around. Next, let's have a look at brushes. Now I've got a few different types of brushes here. These are large brushes, but the small ones, it's just for the sake of being able to see it well. There's a few basic types of brushes which are good to be aware of. You've got short flats, which are this kind of shape. This is a bit of an older one, so it started to round off a bit. We've got long flats, which is this kind of shape. Now this is a big brush I use for large amounts of paint. So that long flat shape will hold lots of paint, and it helps keep the give in the brush as well for a little bit longer. We've got the filbert, which is this sort of curved shape. Some people prefer that because it gives them a softer mark shape, you know, fewer corners, if you like. And lastly, the round, and the round speaks for itself. So a round is good because you can change the width of the mark quite easily as with different amounts of pressure. Now, holding the brush, I always hold the brush near the end, maybe about a quarter of the way along. Sometimes I like to hold it almost like a pencil, but it's more like a drumstick, if you see what I mean. It needs to have a bit of wobble. Every now and again a brush will fly out of my hand because I don't hold them very tight. They need their own weight, you know, and they need to be quite mobile. So feel the brush in your hand. If it feels like you're prodding the canvas with a stick, then you're holding it too tight. If it feels like you're letting the stick tell you how much pressure is going into the bristles, then that's all good. Oh yeah, I should mention these are all bristle brushes. That was an artificial one. That's Chinese hog. I don't know what the kind is. But you could also use soft brushes. You will make flatter strokes. They won't be as good for dense paint. Yeah, paint that's it's got a certain amount of resistance to it. But that's something for you to experiment with. Try it as you go along. So I would recommend these sorts of, these are the basic sorts of brushes. If you have a set and it has a fan brush in it, some people think they're for blending, some people think they're for doing trees. They're actually for, I think you're meant to clean your earwax with them. I can't think of any other use for them. No, don't stick them in your ears. They're not for that. Yeah, maybe propping the bin lid open, I don't know. But there's certainly not much use for painting. Of course, you can use any tool for applying paint. So if the fan brush turns out to be the right thing, then absolutely use it. But we generally won't want to touch anything like that. Certainly we won't want to be blending, not with a fan brush at least, and we won't want to be guided by the shape of a brush to what kind of marks represent something. So the idea that that's how you do trees, it's not helpful. Yes, so holding the brush, if you find yourself holding it like a pencil, that's going to restrict you. The reason we hold a pencil like this is because we're making very small finger movements. So unless you're doing marks that are that small, about the size you write, then you're holding it too far along. So even halfway is okay. Sometimes I'll make marks, I'll just be holding the brush at the end like this. And I can do whole paintings like that. You don't lose accuracy, and actually it makes your hand steadier. So if you relax it, you can try it now. Hold the brush, just let it rest against the surface so that it's relaxed. And then just try and pull it down in a straight line, and you'll find that the brush does a much better job of being straight than if you try and do this, where it would wobble around from side to side. And it's much easier to use like that as well. So that's your basics with brushes. In addition to our palette and our paints and our brushes, we're going to need a surface to paint on. Now, most of you have probably got one of these. This is a stretched canvas on a stretcher, raw on the back, primed on the front. The priming is to protect the fibres of the canvas itself from the oil, which would rot it over time. But it's still absorbent, so when we paint on it, the oil will still leach out of it into the canvas, and that will give us what we'd often call a dead layer, where the paint lacks luster. But that's okay, we can use that, and especially as a ground, we can have a dead layer of paint which will seal the surface. So when we paint on top of it, those subsequent layers, the oil isn't leached out because there's a layer of paint beneath it, and that's what we're going to be working towards with our process. Canvas is good because it has what we call a tooth. It's got a texture on the surface, so as we drag the brush across it, it pulls the paint off the brush. Easy to make marks. I'll be demonstrating one of these. This is a canvas panel, and it's basically just a piece of board with canvas glued to it. Now, because it's not open at the back, the evaporation will be slower and the absorption will be less. And that's really the only difference between them. Other than that, the texture is the same, the immediate reaction of the surface is the same, so that's not a big difference. Some people like to work on panel. That's a smooth surface, and you need to treat that. Here I have exactly the same panel. This has been given a coat of non-absorbent acrylic primer, which effectively sizes the canvas much like a ground layer would. So if I'm working alla prima, as in wet and wet, and in one session completing a painting in one go, I like to have that sized surface so that none of the paint goes dead. But if we're working in layers, a dead layer is really useful, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. The other question I'm often asked about is gesso. Now, gesso is something that was used a long time ago when people used to paint on panels. That was all they had. So basically planks of wood, and they would coat it with plaster and chalk and rabbit glue mixed up together, which would make this thick surface, which could then be rubbed and sanded down until it was smooth. It would also give them a surface to paint on, but they would give it, they would size it, they would give it a ground layer, usually of lead white, which is a very strong paint film. So a lot of the old paintings are made that way. That's really not applicable anymore. There are some purists that will still do that. It's really not necessary. And, I suppose unless you really want to recreate the way those old paintings are made. But these days, having a bit of tooth in the canvas, having a bit of texture left is good, so you don't have to worry too much about gessoing. You just need to be thinking about the absorbency. That's a far bigger factor than what material you coated it with. So you can give it layers and layers and layers of primer, you've still got a surface of primer, and that surface is still going to be absorbent. This is a painting I made, just a simple little oil sketch, simply to demonstrate the process. So this is a painting where I've worked one layer over another, and you can see it's a little flower in a bottle on the windowsill. There's a few different things going on there. This looks like the same painting, but if we look at it, we'll realise there's different layers that have been separated out from one another. So this is my drawing stage. It's really rough, really vague. Then there's a ground stage, and it puts in the basic colours, but it's not going to the strong colours. Notice how all the brighter colours come afterwards. And it's also not getting into anything that's very light or anything that's very dark. And then finally, that top layer finishes the picture off. So we're going to be seeing, I'm going to be reminding you of this in lessons to come, and it also gives us the opportunity to see other qualities. For example, I can take one layer, like the top layer, let's put some grey paper under that, and you can see exactly what the top layer is if you take it in isolation. There's an awful lot of painting that isn't there, that's done by the underneath layer. There's a lot of spaces, but that's okay. Now if we take the layer above that, you can see that covers pretty well. I'll put some white behind it. Yeah. Cool. You can see there isn't much canvas showing through, but there is a little bit. So if that were white canvas, it would be quite jarring. So that first layer, getting rid of the white of the canvas, is actually quite important, quite useful. And then we put them together like this. You get the whole image. I have another example of the same process here. Here's a drawing stage. Again, we'll be showing you this later on. There's a basic ground. Still bits of the underneath showing through. None of the colours are very strong. Here's a top layer. I've done one demonstration glaze over that. As you can see, I'm starting to brighten it up, make it stronger. So you can sort of see that next layer, the details in, some of the details in the grapes and what have you. And then a finished glaze layer over the top can bring us to this, and that's where the colours really pop. That's where the contrast really gets turned up. So this is just a little example. Now this is taken to a stage of glazing and detail. It's a little bit inspired by the Dutch approach. I haven't done anywhere near as many layers as they used to do, but that's there. But from this stage, and even from this stage here, you can go in all sorts of different directions, but we're still doing the same things. We're strengthening the colours, we're finding our edges, we're making things lighter and darker. So those are the few examples of the process we'll be looking at first. And the first thing we need to look at is the first stage. So I'm going to talk you through that next. Okay, now I'm just going to talk you through starting off an image. This is the first stage of a painting, which combines two things. It combines something called the imprimatura. So I'll talk you through an imprimatura. This is just thinners on the brush. I've just dipped the brush. So some thinners there. I'm going to pop a little bit of raw umber into that. If you're using burnt umber, that's always good as well. Just to make a nice neutral ground. Now we were talking before about how I've got my colour wheel here on the palette, but I've also got light and dark colours. Now if that colour is light, like the yellow ochre here, or either of these yellows, like the red, then you're going to end up having to use more paint in order for that to show up tonally. And here we're really just trying to put pigment on and hardly any oil. So that's why I'm using thinners. That thinner is going to evaporate. So if I start to apply some of that to here, this is what we'd call an imprimatura. And it's getting rid of the white of the canvas. It's also starting to put a very thin layer of paint on, which will help size the canvas. Now when I say size, what it means is that it changes its absorbency. So this first layer, straight onto the primed canvas, is going to be absorbed. So if I go to wipe that off, I'll have trouble getting back to white, even if I get a clean brush with some white spirit on it. I'm going to scrub into that. And this has only just gone on. So you can see, if I rub that back, this has still got quite a bit of pigment on it. So that gives me a surface to work in. There's also a tonal value there. So while I'm doing this, I could say I'm going to put in a few big tonal shapes. I could even put in a few little lines, a few little placeholder lines. What I'd like to show you here, I'll use a small round brush for this. As I look at my subject matter here, I might make a nice little triangle. So including the shadows, I've got this triangle shape here. It might extend beyond the subjects. And that's quite a pleasing image. I can draw that triangle in the air, and then I could put it here. that's roughly the triangle I was looking at. I don't mind if it goes off the edge a little bit. And into that I can put in where those shadows fit. So that shadow is going to go along here. I'll use my big brush again. And then this shadow would sort of tuck in underneath it. That would put my orange on the side there. You know what, I might change this, I might make this landscape. I'm still free to change my mind about this stuff. And it's really nice to have some freedom at the beginning to do that kind of thing. Let's scrub this in, let's go again. Again, I'm not putting thick paint on. It's got thinners in it. You can see right through it, look. And let's do that triangle again. Let's try that again. Yeah, so that's the angle at the top. Yeah, so then the edge of the mug would come out of there. So I could start finding my way around the canvas. That's too far across, I can move that across. Because it's a triangle, any shape you make it, it's still the same triangle. And then, yeah, a bit steeper there. So that's where my shadow comes out, over here. That's roughly where that shadow is there, which means the underneath of the mug is here, so there's a shadow side of the mug. There's a shadow on the inside of the mug. That's going to put the handle just above here. Okay, and then my orange is going to be around there somewhere. I can now use my piece of rag here to make a few lights. If it doesn't do a good enough job of making lights, just take that in. It behaves itself. Come on, yeah, you do. Good. There's a light shape. Light goes across. And before I know it, I've got an image starting to turn up. Yeah, there's some light in that orange there. Little space in between them. That's rather good. So I've got an image and some tonal values there. That mug's right in the middle, but I'm going to leave it there for the moment. I'm not worrying about it. I could even put in some other things like where that background line is, where it changes colour. Yeah, deepen that shadow in there. Take a bit of light off the top. What I'm not doing is worrying about edges. I'm just doing soft shapes. And yeah, that's good enough to get going with, really. So that is what you might call, let's put some light on that mug as well. So that wishy-washy thinners and pigment layer is the Imprimatura. This image which is starting to appear out of it is often called a grisaille. It's really just a tonal version at the beginning. So that edge is important, that's a hard edge. This one, let's make that fuzzy. There's a lost edge between the shadow and of the mug and the shadow on the surface. Same with the shadow of the mandolin and the shadow of the maybe that needs to come up with it. That's okay. Now what you can do is you can let this dry, and in 5 or 10 minutes, depending on the surface you're working on, what thin is that, I think, depending on the surface you're working on, those thinners will have evaporated and you'll be left with what's effectively a raw canvas. Now the idea of an imprimatura, this sort of first layer, is that it would have a few days to dry and it might have a bit more paint in it. But here we're sort of bridging that gap, if you like. I don't know what's going on there. Anyway, I'm going to leave that for 5 minutes. I'm going to come back and see how dry it's got. I'm still free to move things around, to change my mind if I like, but you should be able to see now similarities with this here. You can see my triangle I found. You can see the basic areas of light and dark. There's a few lines there where I felt I needed them. For painting on top of, that's a really good surface. Okay, I've just put this on the radiator for a couple of minutes just to speed things up. But this now, I can rub my hand over that surface, and there's a little bit of brown coming onto my hand, but mostly it's very hard to disturb what's there now. That gives me a certain freedom with what I do next. Now I've got a slightly different view of this than you because of the, I'm using a camera and actually I want to paint this using my eye. So now now this paint isn't cured in that the oil in it is dry. It's just so little oil there, it's mostly just some pigment on the surface. So it's almost like a layer of pastel in that you can disturb it, but it'd be quite hard to rub it out completely. So using that as a starting point, I'm going to start to put in a few darker shapes. Now I'm following those principles of big shapes to small shapes, of soft edges to hard edges, of dull colours to strong colours. But there's a few lines and things I want to pick out where they're relevant. And there's a few edges I do want to be able to see. So like there, quite happy with that. Take a little bit off it. Sort of a shape there. But I'm not getting too caught up in outlines or anything like that. Same with, I'm just looking at lights and darks. Same with this here. And that's going to give me enough, a bit more angle to that, I think, quite like that. It's coming out up here. So I can change my mind about where things go. I can keep using my piece of rag to take away excess paint. But mostly, I'm fairly comfortable with where all that's ending up. Similarly here, I just went on and round it off. And now I feel like I've kind of got some detail on there, even. But I'm not trying to make it all exact. I'm not doing careful outlines. I'm thinking in terms of the shapes and the tones, and that shadow's all a bit lighter. A little bit darker behind there. A little bit. That shadow moves up a bit. Yay. So, having a bit of fun, moving things around, having a play around with it. And just a few extra marks based on that first rather fuzzy, vague bit of painting. The same here, there's too many outlines there, so I'm going to soften that down a bit. So I've still got loads of freedom to change my mind about what goes where on this, but I've also got a basic tonal range. Now the problem with a white canvas is that whatever you put on it is going to look dark. So here, by setting some tonal values, when I come to mix paint and put on a ground, it will give me some feedback as to whether I've got the right tones. So all I have to think about is the colour. That should make things an awful lot easier. As I move around, actually, yeah, if I move across a bit, my view changes, but not a great deal, but there is this little shape in there. I like that, that's descriptive. There's this here. And there's this here again. So I'm just looking at shapes and tones, and I've got enough of an image there to start working into it. I think I'm fairly comfortable with that. Yeah, I'm looking for where there's some hard lines, what's darker or lighter than what, and yeah, I'm not worrying about little details like the base of the mug or any of that kind of thing. And again, I can change this around with the next layer, so I've still got a certain amount of freedom. That is your grisaille and your imprimatura. Now, let this dry. It'll cure very quickly, so you know, probably less than a day. But if I were to come back to this the next day, this surface is going to be less absorbent. It's not going to suck as much oil out of the paint or spirit out of the paint, which means that paint will be more present when it dries. Okay, so next week we're going to be starting to put in a ground, which means mixing up some proper colour and thinking about how we want our painting to progress and to build an image.